Well, hello and welcome to another SonicLAB. Today we're looking at the Korg Drumlogue, which is 11 voice analog / digital, well, I guess hybrid drum machine, which is what it says here. We first saw this, I think it was in October in Sheffield at Synthfest. Korg UK were a little surprised, I think, at it being announced because nobody had heard of anything coming. And it was announced and there was no stock. The stock has now subsequently started to come into the country. Korg got in touch and said, do you want to take a look at this? I know some of you will already had this already, but that's just the way it goes. It's actually kind of quite compact. We've got wooden end cheeks. And the top surface is, standard drum machine fare. We have 4 analog voices, bass drum, snare drum, low tom, high tom. Then we have 4 digital voices, close hi-hat, open hi-hat, rim shot and clap, 2 sample playback tracks, and then a multi-engine, which can be anything from the on-built synths, but there's also, like there is with the Korg NTS1 and the Minilogue XD, there's this little bit of sort of code that we can load user stuff into. This comes with something called Nano, which is from Sine Vibes or Cinevibes, I don't know how you pronounce that exactly, and that's a sort of little analog synth. You'll also notice that I was playing pitched stuff on the sample playback, which I was. This is something that's new with the latest firmware, which I've literally just downloaded. But anyway, more on this instrument. Each instrument has its own output level. There's a stereo output plus 4 individual outputs, which is really handy for a drum machine because that means we can send, kicks and whatnot. There's a stereo audio in, which will go into the effects. Sync in and out, which I guess will run with all the Volcas and all that sort of stuff. MIDI in and out on full size, which is nice to see. USB, which I used here, that will do MIDI and firmware updates. You mount it as a sort of a flash drive and then drop the binary file in and then it'll load up. But then also we've got a 2 device, which is what I'm doing here. So I've got this plug up USB source that's going into this Arturia key step, which is being powered via the Minilogue, and it enables me to play via the keyboard, or that could be via pads or whatever. So it's quite fully featured, but there's more. There's also 3 effects tracks. We've got delay, reverb, and a master effect. The master effect, if I switch this on, because this display, while it's quite clear, is a bit small. So what I've done is I've made a zoomed in version of it. We've got all these different kinds of master effects. The algorithms, you might recognize some of these reverb algorithms from the NTS1 and the Minilogue XD, and then we've got these various different algorithms here as well. It's actually quite intuitive to play with, although, you will need to spend a little bit of time sort of getting used to it. In fact, there are some little chops that I noticed from the Korg SQ64, which is their sequencer. So sort of live looping, we can chain patterns, we've got accent, we've got motion control for different voices as well. But the main thing is really that we've got kind of knobby control of a lot of the voice parameters, more so on the kick and the snare, and then less so on the other ones. But there are each voice, as you're in live mode, each voice, if we go into a voice, we then page up and we get all of these parameters for the engine, including the mix and the output. And that depends what you're essentially, it changes depending on what voice type you're on. And then also you've got the effects. You might notice there's a funny little line on some of these. I'm not sure how whether there's anything kind of missing on this one, but I noticed there's a few funny lines on the display that do seem a little bit shonky, if I'm honest. Okay, so let's just initialize that patch. That's shift and init. You might not be able to make this out, but there are kind of light grey legends. There's a lot of shift functions in here, which, although you might think it's a real pain, it's quite quick to get around. I mean, there is no denying, though, that this is quite a small unit, so we can't have knob per function. I know other reviewers have criticised that, and I think that's a fair point, but, this is a compact unit. Right, so shift, init, program and kit initialize. So let's take a look at some voices. I'll bring up the larger display so we can see that. Kick drum. Drive, tune, decay, the front panel parameters. Then we go into sweep, so we can. So these are kind of like, you know, like synth-toms, I guess. But if we come back here, we'll take this down. We've got different attack portions. So these are the transients. That's solid attack. Quite like that one. It's a sort of wet attack. Then we can set the hole. We can set the level of that. Let's go back. Let's try another. So the whole kind of, there is a whole portion of the envelope. I'm not sure if that's just the analog part or the attack part. And then we've also got a resonant filter which flips between high and low pass, so we can create sort of resonant stuff there. I'll just initialize the kit again. Snare drum is very much your sort of 808, 909 kind of thing with, again, we've got the decay of the body. Then we can tune the body. Then we've got the decay of the snap as well. But parameters are, we've got an 8 model, which is obviously 808, a 9 model, which is more a 909 model, white noise, red noise, pink noise, blue noise, lo-fi. These are the sort of, I guess, the snappy types that change. And then we've got the tone. I think that's the tone of the snap. And then the snap level, second. And then we've also got a cut-off filter, which does the same thing as well. Low tom, very much like the bass drum, where we have different attacks on it, and then just a sweep, pretty straightforward, and the level of the attack. High tom is exactly the same. Then we get onto the samples. We've got 4 samples because I said there are 11. It's quite a strange number, 11. So closed hi-hats, again, types of hi-hats, hi-hats, closed hi-hats to decay. So a few there. I mean, that sounds like a 909 style, and we can tune that. We can take the attack off, give it more of a breath. We can change the sample start and sample end. Then there's a drive and a sample reduction. Then again, a resonant filter. Again, I mean, these hi-hats don't sound massively choppy, you know, but you've got to remember that most of these drum machines, you know, these classic sounds, they wouldn't, you know, the 909 hi-hat sounds pretty rubbish coming straight out, but usually you would take it out of one of the separate outs and then do your EQ magic. You know, there would be stuff that you would do to make it silky or give it that sort of classic sound. So some of these sounds may sound less impressive kind of out of the box, but there are tricks that we can do. Say, for instance, on the hi-hat, we can put the high-pass filter up, and bring the resonance and the high-pass filter, so that gives us a bit more top. Ditto on the open hi-hat. By the way, we don't have to stick to these assignments. We can choose the banks of samples, of which there are a bunch in here. Then we've got user samples as well. We can have those. Then we've got rim shot, which again, same sample parameters, and all the usual suspects. Some claps. Then we've got sample slots. Then there's the VPM, which is a sort of synthesized sound, and we've got different parameters. This is sort of like ring mod type stuff. Then there's also, if we check, we can change from VPM to noise. Yeah, different noise types. And then finally there's the user, which if we go part user, that's Nano, which is the sine vibes thing. Then we've got different parameters in here. We can detune oscillators, balance between them, low pass filter, resonance. There's actually a sort of minimal voice in there. And if we go back to our MIDI keyboard attached. So now I can play that on the keyboard, and if we come back to the voicing, we've got a load of extra parameters, including different filter types and resonant. And all of these parameters can be recorded into motion control for additional motion. And the fact that I can play this keyboard, I can play it into the tracks. I can't play the notes into the sequencer. The only way I can do that is by going into motion record, and then the notes I play on the keyboard will be recorded as a motion track. I know that a couple of other reviewers had problems with version 1 firmware because the MIDI didn't really work properly. Version 1.1, which is what I've loaded in here, which was as of today, the triggering and the MIDI seems to work fine from the external MIDI host keyboard. So in this rather cod groove, just got a very simple thing. Actually, it's probably a little bit too much reverb on that. Let's take that down a bit. But I can play. This is the sort of sound I can make. On that synth part. There's a little bit of drive in there, which is pretty cool. We can mess around with cut off. LFO speed. So, I mean, you can get actually, you know, a useful synth voice in it. I mean, that was just 2 oscillators tuned apart with a bit of a fifth, and you can set the balance. So, you know, as a synth voice, it's quite handy, and I'm sure there'll be other little DSP snippets that people can load in there, because again, we've got that same engine, like the Korg NTS1, the Minilog XD. So I guess Sine Vibes and others will provide that sort of stuff as time goes by. Just initialize that again. Let's just look at, there's a couple of other parameters that are going on with the mix. So if we come out here, we go the pan, we can pan that, but we've also got this spread, which kind of gives us this sort of sample delay. So it's almost, you can get quite a sort of stereo feel out of it. It's quite handy. You might think that that mix area would be where you assign the separate outputs for the voices, but it's not actually. You have to go to Shift Global, and then I think it's button 4, and then we can assign the individual voices out to voices. Now, it's a bit disappointing that we can't actually send like multiple things to the same output. These are mono outputs by the looks of things. So, you know, we can have a huge bass drum, snare drum, whatever. So you could do bass drum, snare drum, and 4 separate outs, and then run all of your other, you know, maybe stereo image stuff out of the stereo output. Once you've assigned an instrument to the output, then if you want to take it out of the stereo mix, these knobs at the top, which are the levels for each individual instrument, these are the ones that feed the stereo mix. So taking the bass drum out of output 1 and turning it down here means it no longer appears in the stereo out, but it does appear in audio out. So the routing is reasonably flexible. You can also route the metronome to the main outputs, or just the headphones, or both, which is also a nice touch. So you could use the headphones for a live drummer or someone who needs a click track or a click track feed, which is actually quite a useful thing. Okay, so now what I'm going to try and do is cover a bunch of remaining features by demonstrating it in one pattern. And the first thing I'm going to do is talk about samples, because I've got some samples I've loaded in here. And I thought it'd be interesting to see how it handled that breakbeats, because there is actually not very much memory in this. I think it's something like 32 megs for everything, and that includes user samples. And user samples are a little bit obscure to get in. There is a line in the manual which basically says they have to be named a certain way. They need to be WAV files. I did mono 44.1 and 48, and they both seem to work. Then what you do, you have to name them a certain way. So if I come to the screen here, we go to, there's a sample there. I'm in live mode. So I've called this 001 break 4248. I've got other ones in here. I've got 2 breaks, basically. Good old school breaks. Now, the first thing that I noticed with this is the way that the samples are handled is they're handled like a drum envelope. They're not one shot. So if we look here, I have my break. This is the, that's the first note, and you see it tails off. So that's the maximum decay. So it's not a gated sample. It's not a one-shot sample. So what I had to do, and this is a little bit irritating, is I then had to, that's the first 2 beats. Second 2 beats, what I had to do is I loaded the same sample into the sample 2 voice and changed the start time. And it's still only getting kind of almost 2 beats. And then at the end, I got another one, which is just this guy, and the sample endpoint. The sample start and end points are not terribly accurate, but you'll notice that basically to get a break in, I had to use up 3 of my sample slots. So that only leaves me with the analog and the multi-voice. So that is a limitation that I think you need to be aware of. I have spoken to Korg, and I know that the kind of the one-shot mode for samples is on the list of things to do, and I'm sure it'd be a pretty straightforward thing to do. They just need to figure out how to handle it, but you've got to... So anyway, what I've got is... Okay, so let's listen to my part here. This has got the breakbeat, so I've got... if we go into live mode... This one actually, I've got some resonance and a high-pass filter. Just giving it that kind of extra woof under the kick drum. Then on this guy, got a bit of drive and I'm sending it to the reverb. This one is dry. This is a tambourine. This is another break I've got, which is, I can't remember exactly where that came from, but again, it's limited by, you know, we can't hear all of it. So if I press my play button now, we'll hear the entire groove. That tambourine works nicely. So if I go, I can show you what I'm doing with this. So the tambourine, go into step mode, accent, got a little ratchet at the end there, and I've also, if we go to the probability, I could set that so that's only every other bar. Then we go to my kick drum, probability is every other bar, then I think this one is always, and then a bit further on I've got, let's see, always. So there's a bit of variance going on there. I've got a bit of snare just backing it up. I think that works quite nicely actually. So now what I want to do is play some bass in there. So I've got my MIDI keyboard attached via the host method. I'm playing the, let me see, what voice have we got? We're playing the Nano, and I've got 2x saw, and I've got cut off quite low. So it's quite a sort of subby kind of sound. So record that, I'm going into motion record, and then hit record here. So let's just play that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. That's not actually what I played, is it? It's not quite there. So I think there's still a little bit of glitchiness with the MIDI going in. It's been somewhat improved in version 1.1, but I guess this isn't really a real-time MIDI sequencer with gate lengths and all those and velocity and whatnot going on. So you need to play it in carefully, then I suppose I could go in and tweak those, but it's not quite. Let me see if I can get it any better. So I'll just come back here, clear that part, and then I'll try and play it again. Okay, that's a bit better, but still not quite exactly what I played. So worth bearing in mind, it's not going to give you a kind of really faithful MIDI sequencing kind of experience, but it means I can play that little break line. So next up, what I'm going to do then is I'm going to go, I like that. I'll save that in my kit with the new bass line, save. Excellent. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to save this kit into the next memory, clear my bass line. Let's just make sure I've got my, clear my bass line, clear part, and then maybe we'll tinker with the breakbeats and change it around a bit. Let's get into low. So I'm changing my bass, so there we go. A little bit messy, but that's the idea. So now what I'm going to do is, so let's just change the sound a little bit. Yeah, that's a bit more grungy, so then let's just record something in with this. 1, 4. Okay, that's able to play that a little bit more realistically. All right, that's cool. Let's stop that. So now I can think, great, I've sorted that out. I'm going to save that into, save it back into this. So now that will have the tweak in my voice, because when I save program, that saves the kit and the pattern, right? So here we go. So I'll come back to my previous part, select and hit go, and that should bring me back. Right. And this is a bit more of a serious flaw in my opinion. So what's actually happening is the kit and the program and the pattern are kind of separate. The program is a reference to the kit and the pattern. So if I save my program, it's not actually saving all the data, it's saving the reference to the data. So if I actually wanted to save that new voice, I'd have to save the kit into a different place, let's say whatever, and then save the program. So effectively, to save the whole thing, I've got to save at least 2 program locations. And that starts to get, I don't like that way of working. I would much rather, I just save this thing, here it is, I recall the program, it comes back exactly as I just saved it with all the tweaks, all the pattern changes and everything. And this is just the way that Korg have decided to organise the memory, which I don't think is the right way to do it, if I'm honest. And I think that's quite a flaw just in terms of workflow, because if you're sort of playing fast and changing, you know, you don't really want to be thinking, oh, I need to save this here and save that there, and thinking about, have I already written this? Do I need to name it? Because will I remember I called it init and it's in you know, location B12 instead of B13? No, I'm probably not if I'm trying to actually make a beat. So I think that's a bit of a major criticism, and I'm sorry to see that it's like that. We've also got a chain function, press and hold. Let's just delete the chain we want in there. Now, if I want to create a chain, I think we've got 2, 4, 6, 16 slots we've got. This is a global one. I don't think there's actually any way to save and name these in terms of songs, but I just press and hold. Slot 1, let's go to my, let's have my breakbeat one that I selected there. Then in slot 2, let's go to back alley, whatever that is. And then in slot 3, light steps. So there we go. We've got our 3 plays. And then back again. So it is quite rudimentary, but it does mean that we can change things on the fly, and that'll work that way. I should also point out that it is quite real time. You know, there's nothing that's really interrupting play. There's nothing that actually breaks the flow of beats. You know, even saving happens in real time, even though it's a little bit convoluted for my liking. All of these things will happen in real time, so it's very much kind of performative. Okay, I haven't covered everything, I'm fairly sure, but what I'll do now is just play through a few of the onboard patterns and give you a bit more of a flavour of what this is capable of. Okay, let's start with something called mu bass. Let's try one next to that. I should point out, it's possible we could just change the actual kit within that same groove, which is one reason why you would have these separated in terms of memories, but that's just one of the benefits of doing it that way. Some nice swing grooves here. Let's do executing the loop. Let's try. Nice swing beat there. Nice to see a 2-bar pattern going on. You can actually set it so that when you're loading programs, the tempo is locked and it won't change tempos. Sounds like one of mine. And then finally, my little breakbeat break. A couple of other features to mention is we've got groove. So shift and groove allows us to apply a global groove, which are kind of, I suppose they remind me a little bit of those kind of Steinberg quantize maps. So you can get a little bit of sort of groovier, less regular quantizing, and you can affect the velocity and the time. You can also set that, if you go groove, shift, you could set it to an individual part. So for instance, you know, that would be part groove, open hi-hat. So we can set those for each individual groove. We can also set the time. So we can have eighth notes and also add triplets to that and set the length, the global length of a pattern up to 64 steps. But if we want to, we can change that on a part basis. So if I wanted, say, the hi-hats, I could have the length of that being another. So we end up with, I think it's called polymetric, isn't it now, where you can have different parts rotating in different ways. And then when you combine that with the probabilities and all of that business, so if we go to step mode, you know, we set the probabilities. You can set some really complicated rhythms happening in that way. So quite an impressive amount of programmability there. I think where I'm less keen is there's very little memory in this, and I think there should possibly be more. 32 meg seems a bit slim for this day and age, and particularly when we can just drop our own samples in there. I'd like to be able to use it to maybe trigger phrases or that kind of thing. I can't really do that, and until they fix the one-shot mode, I'm even limited to, you know, the length of samples. But that's something that I'm sure they're going to fix pretty quickly. I think the other thing is obviously the way that they handled the storage and the memories. It's really not a very intuitive way to work for me, and I would have preferred it if there was just a save this now, jump between them without having to mess around with patterns. I understand why you would do that, but it does mean that you have to have a handle on what you're doing when you're thinking about where you're storing memories and whatnot. So the Korg Drumlogue is available now. It's priced at around £489 UK pounds. Which feels like, you know, it's £100 cheaper than some of the competition, though I might be tempted to spend a little bit more and go for something like the Roland TRA-S, which has a little more sampling capabilities and perhaps a little bit better handling of that, although it's got no analogue going on, you know, and it's a little bit bigger. But if the Korg Drumlogue sort of suits your particular niche and analogue is important, don't forget we've got those separate outs as well, then definitely worth checking out. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. That was the Korg Drumlogue drum machine.